The exhibition occurred after an invitation of Kadist that was reconsidering their residency program to be not only limited to artists and curators, but institutions and non-profit spaces as such. And State of Concept is one of them. It's a small-scale institution. It's the first of its kind actually in Athens. We've been running since early 2013. Our program is mostly 4 exhibitions every year, so it is also very similar in terms of pace as Kadist as well. So the title of the exhibition is State and Concept, which plays very much with the name of the actual institution, which is State of Concept. I was always very much interested into the notion of the nation state. It's kind of like a common thread in my institutional power in my curatorial research. Of course, when another institution invites you to kind of reconfigure and look into the 4-year trajectory that you have had, this was the common thread, like this notion of the state. And I was at the time reading a book, State and Politics, that was looking into the theories of Deleuze and Guattari, 2 French theoreticians. I really picked up on this notion of the Urstaat, which in fact is kind of like a neurotic psychological condition of the state itself, that always it reconfigures itself, it announces itself, it self-presupposes its existence, but always referencing a past version of the state. Of course, I wanted to look into kind of the visual representation of that and what a state would be. So the first work is the work of Jonas Staal and Laure Prouvost. Both artists had solo exhibitions with me in 2016. April 2016 was Laure, and afterwards was Jonas. So it's really interesting how the work came about, because it came about also very much into this whole kind of questioning that we have about the European Union, which is a supra-state, again, with common laws. So it's kind of like a bigger umbrella of smaller states. They were at a conference in Belgium of artists thinking about the future of Europe, which was very interesting, which, I mean, for them was not very successful because it included speakers only from Northern Europe, whereas they were talking about financial crisis and the South. So they started discussing of what would a parliament be. Of course, Jonas's practices very much are creating temporary parliaments for political minorities, I would say, or political subjectivities, such as the Kurdish movement, the Filipino Communist Party. He works with Palestinians, and they, in fact, in some countries, they're even considered terrorist organizations. So he brings in organizations in these parliamentary structures and creates a 3 or 4 days assemblies where, I mean, you have intense political speech and discourse arriving, which is something that we lack very much in our current parliaments, I would say. They're much more kind of decorative. Then you have Laure that is very much tapping on this non-human or abstraction of humanity. And so they were there in that conference. They were discussing what would a parliament that they would both create be, and they said it would be an obscure parliament. So the first work in the first room is the obscure parliament, which of course Laure kind of changed the wording of it, because it's very much in her practice to break and dilute language, which I think is also extremely interesting if you look at it into the European context. So it's the obscure parlement. So it's a mixture of English and French, in fact. So it's like a twist of the tongue. So this parliament, in fact, is creating an environment for the non-human, for the hidden human. For me also, it's very much a representation of the other as well, as we see it, because we do see the other as non-human, as a marginalized second-rate human that is not fully human. Let's put it this way. So I think it has very much kind of a subtle commentary on that as well. So you see the plants in the exhibition actually occupying a seat of the parliament. You see a huge tongue, which for me again is very much a great reference in terms of language and what are the lingua francas that dominate Europe as well. What kind of language is used in parliaments, and how kind of structured and dead it is. And if you look at that in terms of our current realities, the Anthropocene, and what the future of politics might be, which would include very much the obscure, non-human, after the Anthropocene, what would happen? I think it's a very, very interesting blend, because you have from one side one artist, which is Jonas, looking at the fiber of politics and how this fiber is going to be changing and reformulating. And then you have more kind of the visual proposition of another artist, which is the visceral, the carnal, the non-human. I would say that her work is deeply political as well, but in a very, very subtle way. So you see Laure appropriating kind of stereotypes very much. She plays a lot with kind of stereotypes that we have for the other, whatever the other is that is not us. But she also visualizes this obscurity of the future and what we will have after. So you have a tongue that is a protagonist, that is a part of the human body, but maybe in 100 years would be an entity by itself. You have plants that have their own kind of living. You have the drawings, of course, that is a bum, that is breasts, that have their own voice, that have their own personality. You have a video work of hers from 2006, if I'm not mistaken, it's from 2006. It's an older piece that is kind of a trademark of her work of referencing through kind of whispering and text this this entity that does not have a gender, that does not have a race, because you cannot see a face, you cannot see everything. But for me also it's a representation of something that is yet to come. The other two artists that have produced new work for this exhibition, Alexandros Tzannis is kind of more following suit through Jonas's position, because he's also looking very much into institutional structures. He's very much interested in this relationship and the dialogue between architecture and the nation state, and how the nation state kind of imposes itself, but very much also the services of it. So he is working with planners and urban planners and architects, and he's interested into maps and how the state is mapping neighborhoods, cities, states, and how the state is constructing them. So he's working very much with official state documents, in fact, that are state maps of neighborhoods, abstracting them completely, and there is the obscure, where the obscure occurs, because you have very obscure kind of forms appearing from it, and you have this manière of deleting, which is with a biopaint, with a constant kind of lines one next to the other. So for me it's kind of like the official mapper of this state and concept in a way, so because he's abstracting it and he's kind of creating a borderless visual representation of it. And then we have Margarita here, which she has been working, Margarita Bofiliou, she has been working many years with painting, but also sculpture, film, video, photography. And when we started the discussions about this exhibition, she proposed that she would create like a tableau vivant of what would be the citizens of this state that is in conceptualization. She has used a lot of digital language, but in absolute relation also to Laure, which I find extremely interesting, is these like part characters that do not, I mean, you see a face but you don't see a body, or you might see a hand but you don't see a body. So it's very much in a good dialogue, I think, with Laure's work, or Laure's departure point when it comes to the obscure. And I want to link that with the works that we are seeing in the second room, which is 2 chapters of works from artists that had solo exhibitions with us. So the first is The Obscure State, and is focusing more on institutional power through the position of the citizen, but also through the kind of more abstract position of the state of what it be. So you have The Dent, which is a film from 2014 by Basim Magdy, which is an Egyptian artist. And the film describes a city Again, this is what I'm very interested in Basim's work, because it's footage from several cities throughout the globe. He doesn't want to give kind of an identity of the city. It is a city that could be any city. So it is the city where the citizens want to host the Olympic Games. And they constantly fail, but they constantly try. I would say it's not a dystopic future. It's very much a reality that the audience can relate to, how we all live in failed states one way or another. If we look at it in kind of Chomskyan, more theoretical way of the failed state, or true failed states that are in financial crisis. And then you have Cao Fei, which is a Chinese artist that is addressing again the city, which I would say is very much the representation of the state in a micro scale. And you have a dystopic scenario of how a city can become a chaotic, extremely violent environment. But then again, you do see parts of your present in it. And then the second chapter, I would say, zooms more into this notion of the violence through the kind of more the position of the citizen, or kind of with more an individualistic representation. So you have Filipa César, which is an artist from Portugal that has been working very much with colonial histories of her home country, Portugal. And she's describing the story as a real story that she has from footage and archives. And then in the film also you have a very young boy that is kind of reenacting these stories through reading.
3 months ago, I was living in an orphanage in Portugal. My escape was being organized while my smuggler was researching liberated zones.
Up to 14 hours a day, walking.
And then you have a film by Zbynek Baladrán that is a Czech artist. So he's very, very directly addressing violence and how we live with violence through language and through all these institutional powers that make us very angry and frustrated because we have to fit into the structures. But he is proposing that through childhood. And lastly, you have Keren Cytter, which is an Israeli artist living in New York, and it's an older work of hers that we actually never have shown in State of Concept in Athens. That very much references, I would say, the beginning, the origin of everything, which is the couple, and what the couple. There are a lot of theories about the dictatorship of the couple and that you have to be in a couple in this society. And I mean, you can, of course, find extremely obvious references to violence, to feminism, to inequality in terms of sexes, patriarchy in general, and how patriarchy represents the state on one side. But also, I would say, this very contemporary, as I said before, this kind of dictatorship of the couple that you are accepted in certain parts of society if you are a couple, and you are a little bit of the other and the pariah if you're not, which is also a really interesting comment for me.